Hello everyone, this is Gary Price and it's time once again for an open access interview. Today we're going to head to Montreal, Quebec, Canada to speak with Kathleen Shearer, the Executive Director of COAR, Confederation of Open Access Repositories.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted. COAR is a very small organization, and so I work for about 2.5 days a week as the Executive Director for COAR. I also have been working for close to 15 years now as a research associate with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, as a consultant with the US-based Association of Research Libraries, and I also work as a consultant for an organization in Canada called Research Data Canada that's looking to implement better research data management practices and infrastructure in Canada. So I wear a lot of different hats, but today I think I'm here for COAR.
Could you also tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, in a way, this is kind of my second career. I have a Bachelor of Philosophy, and as you know, there are a lot of jobs for philosophers out there. So when I finished my Bachelor of Philosophy, I got involved with documentary filmmaking and became a researcher in the area of documentary films, which is a really interesting career, but it's not very stable. I guess because of the instability, I went back to school and got my master's degree in Library and Information Studies. And from there, as soon as I got my master's, I started working with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries as a consultant. So that is really my path coming towards this. And the work that I did for Carl was really around open access issues and institutional repositories. And then more recently, I've been working a lot on the research data management file for them.
Let's talk a little bit about the Confederation. Can you tell us about the history of the organization and funding? Who funds COAR?
COAR was launched in 2009, and it really evolved out of a European project called Driver. Driver was funded by the European Commission, and it was funded to build repositories across Europe and make them interoperable through a centralized harvester. And it became apparent to the European participants in that project that there's limitations to having a regional-based infrastructure. What we really need to do is connect globally around the world, connect our institutional repositories around the world. And so once the Driver project was over, the COAR organization was launched. It's a not-for-profit association. And it was launched with, I think, about 30 members. I've forgotten how many members we had originally. Carl was one of the original members of COAR, and I participated from the beginning as the Canadian representative in COAR. And so we have expanded quite a bit since our launch in 2009, and now we have over 100 members and partners. The majority of our members are based in Europe, probably about 60% if you were to look at it. But we have some very important organizations representing other regions. So for example, we have major repository kind of networks or governments that support repository infrastructure in Latin America, in Japan, in China. So we feel they are although we don't have a lot of individual institutional members from those countries, we feel we still have good representation. And of course, we hope to grow our membership over time. In terms of our funding, we are funded through membership fees, but we have very, very low membership fees. They're 500 euros a year. And originally we started with membership fees of 2,500 euros, and 2 years ago we decided to lower our fees because clearly that was a big barrier for organizations in the developing world. They simply can't join an organization with fees that high. So as you can imagine, 500 euros is not a lot of money to run an organization on, and so we also have received over the past 2 years, since 2015, funding from the European Commission through the Open Air project. And our our task in that project is really around international alignment, so trying to bring together international repository networks to agree on common standards and metadata.
My next question has to do with the state of the open repository world. Do you see it working? What are some repositories doing well, and what could they be doing better?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, there has been large-scale adoption of repositories across the world. So there are close to 3,000 or certainly over 2,000 repositories, and it's become, I think, a pretty common part of the operations of a university library in this day and age. So I think in the conceptual sense, there has been large-scale adoption of repositories. I think historically they have been seen as an institutional mechanism for showcasing the output of that individual institution. And what COAR has been trying to do is promote the global commons and trying to promote repositories to connect more, work together in a better way. And so I think we are, while not really far along that path, we are starting to move along the path of moving from an institutional repository to a truly global knowledge commons, which really adds value to what we're trying to do. So I think we are evolving over time. One of the criticisms of repositories is around the technology. I think we could say, and we could agree, that the technology of repositories is becoming somewhat dated. The way content is exposed through OAI PMH is dated and makes the content not as discoverable as it could be. And so I think one of the things that we would like to do, COAR and working with the broader community, is to try to implement greater functionality in the repository software. And that includes better workflows that really support researchers in what they're trying to do to make repositories more attractive to the research community, but also to try to have greater interoperability so that we can build services on top of repositories. And this is a project we've just launched called Next Generation Repositories. Like even looking at trying to build, for example, peer review on top of global repository content. Is that possible? And can we envision repositories one day as really being the fundamental layer on top of which, the fundamental layer for scholarly communication, on top of which value-added services are built? It's still an open question whether we will be able to achieve that, but I think it's a question worth asking, and it's certainly worth trying to pursue that in the repository community.
Do you think there's still an awareness issue by academics that these repositories exist? And for a lot of academics, I think it's a question of, do they have time to do it in the first place, and then making the decision where to put it?
Yeah, I think both of those are issues, and it really depends a lot on the local conditions as well. How much is the institution that's hosting a repository promoting, making it visible in their local context? So it depends a lot on local conditions. But I do think, again, going back to this idea of improving the functionality of repositories, if we could provide more value-added services to the researcher and insert ourselves earlier on in the process and make the workflow more, less onerous on researchers, I think that would take us a big step towards, more easily populating repositories. In terms of confusion, I do think that's true, and one of the things, the technologies that actually is being developed, I think actually in the open air context, but which is the European research repository infrastructure, but in several other contexts as well, is trying to develop what are called routers or brokers, which help move content around. And if we can develop technologies that allow us to move content easily from one repository to another, we can develop a system where there is just one place to go to deposit, for example. And then we can at the back end move the content around to the most appropriate location. So I think there's potential technologies that can help with some of this, although they haven't been developed and implemented yet. I think they're on the horizon.
Can you give us a couple of examples of what you mean by value-added services that might become available in next-gen repositories?
Yeah, sure. Like as I referred to before, for example, peer review services or quality assessment services on top of content is one example. The other is being able to establish those important connections between content that is related to each other. So connecting data sets with articles, with other types of research outputs that are related, building. So this helps, for example, to better track our research output from an institutional or funder perspective or governmental perspective. But also maybe developing collections based on the global network of repositories and curating those collections, developing journals on top of repository content. I think there's a lot of different types of services that might be developed, and probably I haven't thought of them all.
I was delighted to see on the COAR website the launch of a new interest group on controlled vocabularies for repository assets. Can you talk a little bit more about how it came about and the need for a group like this?
Yeah, so I guess it was just a recognition by some of our members that that there is value in having some controlled vocabularies in the metadata that we're adopting in repositories. And so we had actually been working on this for about, the interest group was launched probably a year ago, but it took a while to get us off the ground, to have our initial outputs. And one of the really interesting things about this controlled vocabulary is that it's linking we started with research assets, but we're also linking it using linked data principles to other languages. So we're translating the vocabulary so that we can link content that's exposed in the metadata that's exposed in different languages across repositories. So I think it's important work that we do, because it facilitates greater discovery, and it facilitates, again, connections between related content if we can agree to some degree on common vocabularies. The challenge around that, I think, is, so we have a good group that's working on it, but the challenge around that is trying to raise awareness that it exists and have that it adopted in the context of all the individual repositories around the world. So our strategy around that is to really try to work with the major networks, see if we can get them on board with adopting the vocabularies as they come out, and they are also participating in developing them, and then have them try to promote the adoption in their regional or national contexts.
Do you see the vocabularies being applied manually or using some type of algorithm? Because it's one thing to develop a vocabulary, it's another thing for it to be applied correctly across a wide spectrum of users and user types.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this vocabulary really is being developed with the kind of academic repository research output community in mind. And another part of our strategy around the adoption is whether we can work with the repository platforms to have the repository in the background in in their platforms so that when people are depositing content, they can go through the list of vocabulary items and choose which one would be most appropriate for them. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. There's always going to be, there's always going to be differences in how those kind of things are applied. But I think having one standard that's generally supported by the repository community around the world is a good next step, at least.
COAR had their annual meeting a couple of weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago, in Vienna, Austria. What were a couple of things that surprised you, energized you about what you were hearing from the presentations and from other member organizations?
Well, a couple of things. So that's one of the things was we launched our next generation repository interest group there, and we had a 3-hour meeting, which was very, very stimulating. We had a lot of really thought leaders like Herbert von de Sampel and Leslie Carr, Pandelis Perakakis, who's based in Spain. So we had a really energizing conversation about the need to change the repository platforms, the need to galvanize the community around new functionalities. And there was pretty much a very, very strong consensus around this, both within the context of that meeting and also the broader COAR membership. So I think the time is right. There's just a consensus around this is the time to start developing these new functionalities. And of course now the challenge is how we do that and how we build on that momentum or continue the momentum. And the other thing that struck me was how common the concerns are in different countries around the future of scholarly communications. So we had a presentation from China, we had a presentation from Japan, from our members in Japan and from South Africa and Latin America, and we really do. So there's so much commonality across the regions now. It really is becoming a global system. And there are different challenges, resource challenges and infrastructure challenges in different countries and regions. But I do feel we are kind of coalescing around a common vision, and our concerns, the concerns of one region were really reflected in a lot of other locations as well. So I think that's very promising in terms of helping to move forward and coalesce around common objectives and vision.